I'm Professor Susan Jarowski, bringing you this week's key terms for Law 101. My name is pronounced Jarowski, but some people find that hard to remember, so my students usually just call me Professor J, as the name Dr. J was already taken. The words I'm going to explain in this video will help you understand this week's lecture in Law 101. Let's begin with a question. If you were designing a government for a community from scratch, what would it do? Well, the first thing I think I would do is to set up some rules so we could all get along. For example, so that people wouldn't bash each other over the head when they wanted somebody else's food. If the whole community agrees on these rules, then you've created laws. In our government, the group of people who decide on these rules or laws is called the legislative branch. Next, what if somebody breaks those laws? If we have laws but no ways to enforce them, the laws would be pretty useless. What we need is a way to make sure that these laws are carried out or executed. No, not that kind of executed. Executed means to carry something out. One example of these are police officers, but there are more laws than just laws that punish people. There are laws that make sure that there are people who help put out fires, collect trash, deliver the mail. The people whose job it is to carry out the laws make up the executive branch of the government, because they execute the laws. But what if one person thinks she's following the law, and somebody else thinks she isn't? What do we do when people disagree over who is complying with the law? What if both sides think that they are right and the other guy is wrong? You need another branch of government. You need a group of people who decide who is right. These people have a special role to hear all sides of the argument fairly and to make a decision as to which one of them is more correct. These are the judges, and the whole system of judges is called the judicial branch, or sometimes the court system. Now, if you have a very small community, everyone in the community can take on all three functions. They can all decide the laws, carry them out, and decide who's right or wrong. But as the group gets larger and larger, it's harder to have the whole group do everything. So in our system of government, we divide up these roles. There are specialized branches of government, each one tasked with a different part of this, executive, legislative, or judicial. Their roles are to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens. This certainly isn't the only way to structure a government. You could have a king, for example, who took care of all three functions. But our three-branch system helps provide that no single branch can take over the government. We'll talk more about these checks and balances later. For now, just realize that there's a reason that we have three branches of government. So our first vocabulary words are legislative branch, the people who make the laws, the judicial branch, the people who decide who is right, who's following the laws, and the executive branch, who are the ones who carry out the laws. We'll be discussing each of these branches in much more detail in the rest of the semester, but for right now, this is all you need to know. Now we have three related vocabulary words coming up: jurisdiction, precedent, and common law. They're related as each one builds on the one before it. Jurisdiction is a word that has multiple meanings in the law. It could refer to the power that a court, part of the judicial system, has over a specific person. Let's say me. The judiciary, if it has a jurisdiction over me, can call me into court, can call witnesses to testify against me, can decide if I've done something wrong, and can state what my punishment is going to be. However, not all courts in the United States have jurisdiction over me. We'll discuss more of this personal jurisdiction, these limits, in the litigation course. But for this course, I want to focus more on jurisdiction as it relates to the courts themselves, because there's more than one court in each jurisdiction. Let's look at the state system, for example. Remember my caveman example. They go to a primitive judge, and the judge decides who is right and who is wrong. But many systems have a second bite at the apple, a second chance for you to have your case heard. The first level is called the trial court, And the second one is called the appeals court, and this is usually held before a small panel of judges. We'll talk more about the differences between trials and appeals when we get to the judicial branch. What's important to know now is that the appeals courts write down the official opinion that explains their decision. Trial courts at the state level don't do that. Only the appellate courts do. And I'm going to use a metaphor here. The appeals court and the trial court in a jurisdiction have a relationship like parents or children. Well, like some parents and children, some families. The children normally have to follow the rules set out by their parents. But the children can listen to, but don't have to follow, the rules of their friends' parents. Each of the other states is like its own family. In Hawaii, the Hawaii trial courts have to follow the appellate courts. They can listen to, but they don't have to follow the courts of other states, such as Texas or Oklahoma, California, New York, Florida. They could listen to that, but they don't have to. So jurisdiction refers to the fact that the lower courts must follow the higher courts. And precedent is our next word. See the word precede in the middle of it? Precede means to come first. And it refers to the fact that the lower courts have to follow the decisions of the appellate courts, the ones that come first. So this precedent is simply the body of written laws that other courts in the same jurisdiction need to follow. Now the third vocabulary word, the one that ties these together, is the term common law. Common law means that courts in the same jurisdiction will follow the precedent of the other courts. And while we have the precedent within each individual state that I talked about, we also have the precedent in the whole federal government as a whole. So we follow the state laws within Hawaii, and we're also required to follow the federal laws within our jurisdiction. We'll talk more about these when we cover the judicial branch. But common law is also our system of government. 49 of the 50 United States are common law jurisdictions relying heavily on the court decisions, because England, from where we get our law, was also a common law system. The exception is Louisiana, because it was a former French colony. Following common law is not the only way to organize a government or a judicial system. Two other common ways are using religious law or using a civil law system. We're not going to talk about religious law in this course, but we will talk a little bit about civil law because it is one of our key vocabulary words for this week. It has two meanings. The first meaning of civil law is in contrast to common law. Civil law is the most prevalent system of law around the world. It's not our common law system. In the civil law system, the central law are the statutes, which are the laws adopted by the legislature. The courts have comparatively less power. Countries that use civil law include France, Spain, Germany, China, and Japan. One of the reasons I bring this up is because Americans often have a tendency to think all countries' legal systems are exactly like ours, and if they are any different, ours is better. Well, it makes you a more educated citizen of the world to know that other countries' governments can be organized in a different fashion and still work. So civil law is one of these ways. The other reason I bring up the term civil law is because we'll be using a second definition of this quite a lot in our course. It refers to one of the two primary types of law within the United States. One type of law within the United States is criminal law. I find that most people understand the idea and the role of criminal law as it's referred to in many TV shows and movies. This is the system, and I'll discuss it more in detail in this week's lecture, in which we punish people with fines and or jail time for doing certain bad things, such as murder, speeding, littering, offenses that are against all of us. The government is the one who brings the case to court on behalf of the rest of the citizens. The other part of this legal system is civil law. Civil law, which also is covered more in this week's lecture, is when one person sues another and it involves individual rights, such as medical malpractice, divorce, insurance law, and contracts. We'll talk more about these again in later in this lecture. And that's all of our vocabulary for this week. See you next week.